Good morning, or again, good afternoon. So today we're going to look at one more urban legend. I think this one's slightly appropriate as people over the internet have been talking about Black History Month. So I thought we'd have a look at a black hero from American history, John Henry. Now he doesn't have a surname because no one knows it, or maybe historically he never had one. Now the legend of John Henry goes as he was a steel driving hammerman, which means he literally hit things with a hammer. Now he worked on the railways, so he used to drive the railway pins into the wooden sleepers. They're the pins that hold the metal tracks onto the wooden sleepers so that the trains can go over it relatively smoothly. As legend has it, he was a freed slave. So he'd originally been a slave. Now in the original stories, the chains that held him were melted down and he forged them himself into a hammer, a 14-pound sledgehammer. It's pretty unlikely because if he was a freed slave, the chains would have actually been extremely valuable back then, probably equal in value to the price of a slave. So it's very unlikely that they would have freed him and said, here's an extremely valuable piece of equipment to take with you as a souvenir. It's extremely unlikely that that happened. But to be fair, it's extremely unlikely that any of this happened at all. Now apparently, what happened is he went to work on the railways and they weren't paying people money at the time. What they were doing is, if they could reach their destination, they would be given 40 acres of land, free, gratis. But they had to reach their destination. They had to lay enough railway track to reach that point at a certain date. 40 acres of land is quite a lot. My uncle, years ago, used to have a 12-acre farm in England, and 12-acre farm would have easily fitted Torquay. Easily. It would have taken about 45 minutes, over rough terrain, about 45 minutes to walk the perimeter of his farm. Having said that, it was difficult to get to some parts of it because it was wooded, some of it was swampy. But yeah, it was a pretty big farm. I mean, it wasn't something you could just walk around casually. It was pretty large. So 40 acres is a sizable plot of land. If you were back in the Western era, the 1800s, then 40 acres was about all a man could expect to work. No tractors or anything to get around on. So you're working with your shoes and your hands. So 40 acres is a lot. So he was trying to earn 40 acres so that he could set up his own farm, which he'd always worked on anyway. I mean, he was a slave, so he'd always done farm work for people. So the idea was that he would have his own farm, and that was what he was fighting for. Now, according to the legend, they came pretty close, and then they were told that they'd lost their chance because a steam-powered hammer was going to be employed to finish the job. Now, the steam-powered hammer, no one really knows what that would have looked like or how it worked, because this is ancient history now, and this was lost technology because no one preserved it. By all accounts, if it existed, it didn't actually work very well. It wasn't very reliable. So we're talking about maybe it would have looked like a steam engine, but with a hammer sticking out the side to nail in these nails. Now, apparently in the legend, he offered it to a race. He said, if I can hammer these nails in on this side faster than you can do this side, over the course of about 3 miles, he would back down and they would be allowed to continue and would get their land. Now, according to the legend again, they had to go through a mountain. The machine had a drill to get through the mountain. He had a hammer. Now, this is all very, very far-fetched. But that's what the legend is. And according to the original legend, which is a song, it's a ballad, that was played out, and there's another one called the Hammer Man or something. So according to the song, he did it. He beat the engine. He hammered with his hammer all the way through a mountain, and then died of exhaustion. He just collapsed and died. As unlikely as all this sounds. And that's all fine until we get to the truth of it. Now, that urban legend comes from songs, and it's been taken so seriously that there are plaques. It's taught in schools as fact in America. There are statues of him, of John Henry, and we really have no evidence, really, that he ever existed or where it's supposed to have existed. The historical, and this is a quote from the Wikipedia, the historical accuracy of many of the aspects of the legend are subject to debate. According to researcher Scott Reynolds Nelson, the actual John Henry was born in 1948 in New Jersey and died of scoliosis, not due to exhaustion of work. So he never died during the work, he died years later. That's according to a historian. They don't even know where the location of this was meant to be. We've got one called Big Ben Tunnel. Sociologist Guy B. Johnson investigated the legend in the late 1920s, so again, nearly 100 years later. And you know what? You know what record keeping is like today. Can you imagine what it was like back then? So he concluded that John Henry might have worked in Ohio Railway, C&O Railway's Big Ben Tunnel. But, and I quote, "You can make a case either for or against that." This goes on. Then we've got another one, Lewis Tunnel. So the Lewis Tunnel is by historian Scott Reynolds Nelson. He's discovered documentation of a 19-year-old African-American man, alternately referred to as John Henry or John W. Henry or John Williams Henry. And he apparently escaped from prison. And was a labourer. So again, quite different. So now we've gone from freed slave to a prisoner who was locked up for crimes in another part of the country. We've also got Kuzna Mountain Tunnel. There's another tradition that John Henry's famous race took place in Virginia or West Virginia, but Alabama as well. Professor Johnson in the late 20s received letters saying that John Henry worked on the AGS Railway. A third letter saying it was Oak Mountain. But he discounted these reports after they said there's no such tunnel that matches up to anything they have. So you can see this is a clear urban legend. This is a myth. We've got no evidence that he existed. We've got evidence that he may or may not have existed, depending on how you interpret the data. He may have been a slave. He may have been a prisoner. He may have existed. He may not have done. He may have won his race. He may not. He may have died. He may not. We've got no serious evidence of this one way or the other. People want to believe it. It is a feel-good story. The idea of a man, an ordinary man, being able to take on the technology. It's a great legend. The idea that the world is changing, but what really matters is a man's grit, a man's determination and stamina. That's what really makes the difference between success and failure. The measure of a man. Now in many of the legends, he's gigantic, a huge hulking figure. In the story we're about to watch, he's much smaller, more moderately sized, but we don't know. We don't even know what his name was. So the idea that he's one thing or another, one size or another, is just complete nonsense. We simply don't know. And this is how they get off, and this is how they get started, these kind of legends. People add their own spin to the story. Now, if he existed and he was let's say he was a prisoner, he was an escaped convict, and then someone said, well, that's not a very good story. Let's make him a freed slave. Then the audience is going to be more sympathetic towards him. And then we say, well, he's got to be a legendary character. So let's add the fact that he's huge. In some stories, let's add 2 hammers, bigger hammers. Let's make him more handsome. Let's make him much stronger. Let's have him race a steam engine. There's no way a man could beat a steam engine. Even walking or running, you just couldn't do it. So this is a legendary story that seems to have grown over time as one person's told the story to another, and it's ended up becoming basically almost ridiculous. And this is what urban legends are. And because of the time involved since this happened to the time we are today, where nobody's been able to find any evidence of it, we don't know if it's true or not. People want to believe it's true. People defend it by saying, well, you know, you're racist if you don't believe it, or you're anti this or you're anti that. And all it is another story where there's very little proof that it ever existed. And unfortunately, we've got loads of these in our society from every religion. Christianity, for instance, has no documentary proof that any of this ever happened. We've got Buddhism, where we do have documentary proof that Buddha existed, but there's a debate over where he's buried. We've got all sorts of religions with different stories and no solid evidence for any of them, but people will support those stories with their lives. They will fight and die for their religious beliefs. And we have these a lot, and they're little more than urban legends. They're little more than stories that have spun up from essentially nothing. And it doesn't really make a lot of sense. We have to be very careful who we believe. And we're living in something like this now. We're living in a situation where people are sharing stories that go against science, People are making up science. People are, the current situation we've got, the current social climate, we're basically getting all of our information from social media. We're getting our scientific data from Facebook, a company that have constantly been in court under charges of fraud. Excuse me. Under constant charges of fraud. We've got the American vaccine made by Pfizer, a company that have the worst fraud track record in the history of any company in the world. They've paid the world's largest fraud payments. So they're constantly lying, and they are now in control of all the evidence. And this happens a lot, and we're in a situation where basically we're living by hearsay, and people aren't dealing with facts anymore. It used to be that the internet was respected by being communication for everybody, where the information could get out there and be shared. And now the internet's privatized and has become basically a gigantic propaganda machine. So it's very important, and ever more important, that you do your own research and you're careful what you believe and what you think, because if you don't think for yourself, somebody else will think for you. So be aware of that. Now we're going to watch a short film about John Henry that purports to be the true story behind it. How they're supposed to have got that, I don't know. So again, take that with a pinch of salt. We have no evidence that this is based on any kind of truth at all. It's an interesting story, it's an interesting legend, and it's a very nice parable for the strength of humanity versus the march of progress, which has always been against human interests. Look at the train in the movie, for instance. It's black, it's dark, it's evil, it's smoking, it's anti-environmental. The man on board has goggles, so he has blacked out eyes, so he's characterless and inhuman. And John Henry, by that point, has been established as a sympathetic, decent character, a strong man that we all respect. So it's very little more than a legend, and there's a core to the story that we want to believe, and those are the stories that you need to be more careful of. Look for evidence in all things. Always look for your own proof, and always be very careful what you believe. If you don't think for yourself, somebody else will step in and do your thinking for you.